What's going on, friends? Welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, we're going to be diving into a process or a framework that I use to basically evaluate the quality of directory niches. So this is something that could probably be applied to any type of business, but it's a system that I set up because I've created so many different projects that no one ended up using, no one wanted to pay for. And so now I've essentially developed this system here to kind of walk me through every single step so I can come up with a game plan that is rock solid. Now, there's 6 steps involved with it. The first thing is that I just want to do a high level check of the niche. So there are 5 questions that I typically ask myself to basically evaluate whether or not this is something that I actually want to look into. If I pass that stage of the process, I then move on to the next stage, which is to then do some in-depth keyword research to kind of figure out what the demand is and what opportunities are out there. Then I also dive into the competition. I kind of figure out what solutions are already in the market and, how can I potentially compete. Then I also do some in-depth customer research. So I basically find out what people have to say about the current situation. And I really take a data-first approach with it. So I, use a whole bunch of research tools. I use a whole bunch of AI tools. And it really is something that at the end of all of it will give you an idea of, what particular subsegment you should target first if you want to pick off low-hanging fruit in your niche, what the actual product or your MVP should look like based on what the market is already offering, how you can price your services, how you should basically build a brand around what it is that you're doing. And really the goal of all of this is to translate all of this research into a 30-day plan. Now, if I were to take you through every single step of this today, we'd be sitting here for the next 5 hours. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be focusing on the first part of it, which is the niche check. Now, I do want to remind you before we dive into it that all of these videos that I create, I also create in a written version. So here are all the past ones that I've created. And if you want to basically recap certain steps, you can go in here, check it out. But from time to time, I also add resources in there. I also, add some additions to it based on questions that I receive. And so typically these guides are just a little bit more in depth. The next thing is, if you are interested in learning more about, building out directory sites with no-code tools, subscribe to my newsletter because I always, drop little updates in there that don't make it onto the YouTube channel, and that way you'll be on top of it. With all of that being said, let's dive into the first part of the niche check. So the niche check is really just a 5-step process that I go through where I basically ask myself 5 questions, and basically if I answer a question with yes, it basically makes sense to then move on to the next step. Now, the first step in all of this is arguably the most important question, and hopefully something that most of you can say yes to, which is how much do you actually care about your idea, your niche? Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to put this in here is because I actually started a company with a friend called House Sitting NZ. It was one of the first directories that I set up, and we only set it up because I could build the platform, so we didn't have to pay for a developer to build it. And secondly, my friend is like a top-notch SEO person, and he did research and just found that there were really good opportunities in that space. And so when we created it, we built out the MVP, we basically did all of our SEO stuff, and we started ranking pretty fast, and then we started getting all this traction around what we're doing. However, the more traction we got with it, the more operational things we had to start taking care of. For example, with every new applicant that we received, we actually had to do a police check, and there were just so many more things that were added to our plate that kind of put our commitment to this particular thing to the test. Now, ultimately, I did not want a part of it simply because, one, I was a student at the time. I didn't care about houses and I didn't care about pets. But the larger point that I'm trying to make is that, no matter what it is that you decide to work on, there are going to be roadblocks that are going to come your way. And I find that it's a lot easier to sustain through those roadblocks when you're actually working on something that you care about. For example, with the Unicorn Factory, I've had tons of things that I've had to deal with, but I actually care about, helping freelancers get started. And so there's a lot of, passion and excitement behind that particular project. And so really the first thing that I'd ask myself is, is this something that you're in for the love of what it is that you're about to do, or is this just a quick money making scheme? Because ultimately I think, there are better lower hanging fruits to pick off if it is just purely a money play. Obviously some people will see it differently. I think that this here is a real crucial factor to basically deciding whether or not you want to commit the next few years to building this. The next point is how necessary your directory is. Now, this here really just specifically talks to, how big of a problem this solves for your, buyers and sellers on your directory, or the supply side and the demand side of your directory. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because, oftentimes when you come up with an idea, you immediately get excited about it and you basically put blinders on because you kind of visualize what your business will do and how it will look and all that kind of stuff. But then eventually you'll realize that, you need people to use it. And so what oftentimes happens, and this is something that I did, was, you have your solution and then you try to come up with problems that your platform solves, but really the way that you should approach it is just the other way around. If you want to, get a lot more traction fast, you want to kind of figure out like, how big are the problems that we're dealing with here and how can my platform solve it? Because that way it will be a lot easier for you to, one, find out who you should be targeting. And the second thing is it will be a lot easier for you to kind of, build a solution that is actually really useful to people. The second thing that I want to say about how necessary your directory is really just thinking about the severity of the problem. Now, when I think of what is the problem that your directory solves, it's not even so much about the problem, it's about the consequences of not solving the problem. That's ideally how you want to think about it. And so if we take like two examples here, let's say for example you have you want to rebuild your website and you've got a $50,000 budget. I mean, do you want to get that wrong? It's a high stakes problem that needs to be dealt with. You want to find someone super reliable. So the higher the stakes are, the more people are willing to make sure that nothing goes wrong. So on the other hand, if you build, say, a directory that focuses primarily on helping people find restaurant discounts, which by the way was my first startup, then the problem is that, whilst it might be fun or convenient or neat, at the end of the day, it's not going to change anyone's life whether or not they get a $20 discount on so-and-so. So ultimately, if you want to, get traction around what you're doing fast, you want to pick out, high consequence problems that you can solve for people. And ultimately, it's just a matter of researching or even talking to people in the market, what kind of consequences there are from not solving a particular problem. Okay, the next thing is how easy is it to monetize your directory? Now, if we go through the previous two stages, you can definitely get to the point where, one, you've picked something that you're super passionate about, that you love. Two, you've identified a problem that people have, but then you find yourself in a situation where it's just incredibly hard to monetize. And this is something that I wish on no one. Now, there are a few things that I want to say about it. There are going to be certain niches that where monetizing just comes a lot more natural just because of the nature of the market, but then there'll be others that don't. It's actually super important that you find out in advance whether or not your particular niche solves certain types of problems that your directory solve with money. If it doesn't, you need to kind of think about how else you could potentially approach it. Now, when I think about, how much money I can make off your directory, you can actually break it down to a T. And so there are three key variables that I look at when I'm looking at how much money I could potentially make. Now, because your job in your directory is to connect someone looking for something with someone who is offering something. So if it's, say, a talent directory, a client with a freelancer, if it's say a product directory, someone who is searching for that product and the person who's offering that product, then ultimately the way that you generate value through your directory is by connecting them to each other. So the first thing that you want to think about is, number one, when that connection is made, how much value is being exchanged between the people. So let's take like a super low stakes example. Let's say, for example, I build a directory where I add a whole bunch of affiliate links. Now, when you come on there and you click on my product and you decide, yeah, I want to sign up to Webflow, then what happens is the value that is transacted between you and Webflow is $20 or whatever it ends up being. And so now you can kind of see, well, if the transaction is $20, how much of that can I take? Now, there are typically two variables that you want to look into when it comes to how much of that $20 you can take a cut off. The first thing is the severity of the problem. So if we take, for example, Uber, they have a really great example. If it's like a really nice and sunny day, people have a lot of different alternatives. They can ride a bike, they can take the bus, maybe they can even get a ride with someone. And so typically they don't have a lot of pricing leverage on their side, which is, good. However, there are situations where they have a lot more leverage. For example, what happens if you are out with your friends on a Saturday night and suddenly every single person around you wants to get an Uber home? That is why they invented something. That's why they invented surcharging. So where you're like the pricing surges depending on demand. And so really it reflects how willing people are to make that problem go away. And so the higher that is, the more of a cut you can typically take. So, Uber drivers on average pay a cut of 25% to Uber. That is incredibly high, but why can Uber do that? Well, because there are not a lot of other alternatives left for those drivers. That brings me to the next point, which is market efficiency. So let's say, for example, you're solving a problem by building, a talent directory for freelancers like I did with the Unicorn Factory. The question that you need to ask yourself is, how well does the market as it is right now solve that problem? And so specifically when it comes to freelancers, there are so many different freelancer directories out there, which means that as a platform, you actually have a relatively low level of leverage. And so, if you are trying to think about how can I monetize my site, ideally what you want to do is you want to find high severity problems. You want to make sure that the transaction value, and the transaction value in itself can be low, but if it has frequent transaction, it can bring the overall transaction value up. But you just want to make sure that it's high enough. And then you also want to have a look at how well the market is currently solving that problem, because the more people that solve that problem or the more alternatives people have, the harder it is for you to charge a premium. So those are the kind of factors that you need to look into. I wanted to give you a few specific examples in terms of how this could look in a real practical sense. So if, for example, you want to build a directory for hiring running coaches, the first thing that you want to do is you want to think about, well, every time someone does hire a running coach, how much are they actually paying that running coach? Then the next thing that you want to figure out is, well, how often per year will they pay that running coach that money? And that will give you like an estimated annual customer value. And then all you really want to figure out is on the buyer side, what are the stakes? And on the seller side, what are the stakes? And so you can just go through a whole bunch of different examples, and that will kind of give you an estimate of how much you should be able to charge per successful transaction that you make. Now, the way that you charge it can happen in a lot of different ways. You can do subscriptions, you can do, commission fees. I think it really depends on your setup, but understanding, what your ranges that you're working with per successful connection between buyers and sellers is kind of key. Now, the next thing to look into, and this kind of ties into the previous one, let's say you found your niche that you're passionate about, you've identified the customer problems and the severity of it, and now you've also found out how you're going to make money off it. Now, a problem that you can run into, especially if you're bootstrapping it, is that really good quality markets typically attract a whole bunch of different businesses, a whole bunch of different competition, and you can find yourself in a situation where, your market is just saturated. Now, this happens in every area. It can be, it can be like YouTube, niches that people pick on YouTube. It can be like business models that people choose. Ultimately, what saturated markets mean for you is that typically it's going to lead to a few challenges that you're going to have. Number one, it's going to get a lot harder to get traction because one, you're just going to have to spend a lot more money on advertising. So a real quick check that you can do is to just go on Google for something that would lead to your directory and then just check how many people are paying for ads in the Google search panel. That's number one. The second thing is that, more profitable niches will typically attract, funded businesses, and typically businesses that have been around for longer or who have got quite a bit of funding will be able to invest in areas for user acquisition and specifically SEO. That means that even if you are good at SEO, you're up against a lot of really well-established brands that will be ahead of you in that, which means that even if you are a phenomenal SEO person, it will actually just take so much time for you to be able to catch up, and you can kind of cut that as like a user acquisition stream out of your plans. And then the last thing on this is that, sometimes you can actually get away with building like a really basic product that actually doesn't do anything particularly fancy, but does the one thing incredibly well. But when you're in a super saturated market, you cannot get away with just building a slightly better product, because people are not going to go through the process of wanting to switch simply for something that's just marginally better than what's already in the market. Now, the good thing is that there are still ways to stand out in a saturated market. So for example, when I started the Unicorn Factory, platforms like Upwork were around, Fiverr were around, Toptail, there were actually like so many of them out there, but I still managed to find a little part of the freelancing world for myself by niching down by location. Now, the way that you can, carve out a little part of your market is, like I said, either by niching down on a specific location. The second thing is that you can focus your directory on a specific audience. So maybe you want to have a talent directory for, legal services, or you can focus on, delivering the actual value through your directory in a completely different way. That might be like offering concierge services, a bit more of a hands-on experience. Ultimately, you figure out what the best path is by doing research into your market, seeing what other people do, and so on. Now, there's one last thing that I want to look at when I'm kind of deciding whether or not I want to go down a particular path, and that is typically the reason why a lot of people decide to start a directory or a business in a particular niche in the first place, and that is that they have some form of unfair advantage. Now, I don't think that having this unfair advantage is necessary in order for you to be able to build a successful business, but it definitely makes it easier to get traction around what you're doing. Now, what is an unfair advantage? Basically, an unfair advantage is anything that is not very easily replicated by other entrants in the market, or even by existing businesses or solutions in the market. So, for example, you might want to create like a listing site for real estate agents, and you've worked in the industry for 20 years, so you know heaps of people. If you have those connections, it will be a lot easier for you to get your first few customers on board, your first few brokers on board, and that will allow you to just get proof of concept a lot faster. You'll be able to add more testimonials to your site faster, and ultimately it will put you in a position where you're basically using your connections to get a head start. Another unfair advantage that you might have is that you have certain skill sets. Now, for example, one of the advantages that I had is that I can actually build a lot of these platforms that would otherwise cost, 20,000-30,000 for an MVP by myself. I also have a lot of experience with Facebook ads, which means that I can also run ads to help me get traction faster. If, for example, you have a large social media following, and I actually worked with someone who, created a directory in the publishing niche, started off with a massive audience that he could reach out to. Those are all things that you kind of can't easily get to if you are entering a market. So, if you do have those types of unfair advantages, you need to take full advantage of them, because they are ultimately what are going to speed up the process for getting traction. Now, what happens if you've looked at this list and you're like, oh, none of this applies to me? It's never too late to start building your unfair advantages. You can either start by going out, building your network, going to networking events, even hosting networking events. You're sitting here watching YouTube videos on how to build a directory, so you're learning how to acquire certain types of skills. You can even start by creating content around what it is that you're passionate about, which takes us back to the first step, which is, how passionate are you about what you're doing? But those are really the first 5 things that I'll look into to basically evaluate at a high level whether or not the niche that I want to enter is for me. Now, like I said, this is just the first part in a 6-step process. As soon as I have done that, then we get into the weeds of things. Then we start going from looking at, your directory and your niche at a high level to actually diving into the numbers. And so the next part of this process is going to be to do keyword research. And this is really where you'll get a good understanding of, is this realistic? Is this going to be hard? Is this going to be easy? You'll get a way better understanding of who your competitors are. You'll get a way better understanding of what it's going to take from an MVP in order for you to get the ball rolling. Now, like I said, I'm going to be making more videos on these topics. Please head on over to my website if you haven't already. Subscribe to the newsletter so that you find out as soon as they come out. With all of that being said, I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.